Cannabis crosses the country. I'd also like to welcome our online viewers, as this session will be streamed live on the NCSL website. So everybody wave. I'm Carmen Hansen, Program Director at the National Conference of State Legislatures Health Program, and I track state medical and adult use cannabis laws. This is the third of 3 cannabis-related sessions this year at our Legislative Summit. And it is truly a reflection of the vast amount of questions that NCSL receives on this issue from legislators and legislative staff. Those questions cross at least 4 different topic areas at NCSL: financial services, criminal justice, environment, and health. It really does take a village to track the various policy angles of this issue. In case you missed any of the other sessions, information and related materials may be found on the NCSL app. Sunday sessions covered financial services issues and the interesting play between state and federal laws. Monday's session looked at the federalism and states' rights issues, and this final session is really geared at the most common question that we get asked by legislators and legislative staff, and that is, what can be learned from Colorado and Washington and other early legalization states with the newer states like California, Maine, Massachusetts, and others? Because inquiring legislators and staff want to know. We hope today's session will do just that. This session is not about whether a state should or should not legalize or taking any position on specific related state policy. As a reminder, NCSL does not take any positions on specific state policies, and this is a lessons learned sharing session in direct response to a vote of the people in that state to legalize, regulate cannabis in their state. And legislators take this role very seriously. So a quick housekeeping item. We'll probably be using the words marijuana and cannabis interchangeably, and we'll try to do our best to avoid any unnecessary jargon or acronyms or puns, but they sneak in, kind of can't help it. And today we have 3 panelists with extensive Colorado experience in different areas, and 1 legislator from Maine who will share a variety of lessons learned. We have, and I'm just going to do a quick introduction and then they'll have additional statements. We have Representative Dan Pabon from Colorado, who is deeply involved with the initial legalization and implementation legislation. We have Representative Theresa Purse from Maine, and she is co-chair of the Maine Joint Select Committee on Marijuana Legalization and Implementation, and she's hot off a fact-finding mission to Colorado. We also have a couple of recorded pieces from other legislators from Maine who are unable to join us today. We have Louis Koski with Friedman and Koski, a former executive director of the Marijuana Enforcement Division in Colorado, and he is also a former police officer. And we have Jordan Wellington. He's currently with Vicente Cederberg in Colorado, which is a cannabis a law firm that serves cannabis-related businesses, and he also advises states on regulation and state policy. We'll have some discussion about lessons learned for the majority of the session, and then we'll open up to questions and answers at the end. So I'd like to get this started. We'll have each panelist give a brief kind of opening statement and to go over their experience. Go ahead, Lou.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here today. Good morning, everybody. My name is Louis Koski, and I'll just kind of give you a little bit better idea of what I've been doing with marijuana policy. I've been involved with the issue for over 7 years now, dating back to 2010 when Colorado first started licensing marijuana businesses on the medical side. The division that I was employee of was called the Medical Marijuana Enforcement Division then. When I first got started there, we said to ourselves in conversations internally, we were like, wow, we got to pay attention to what we're doing, because probably maybe at some point in our lifetimes we'll be talking about retail marijuana or adult use marijuana in the state. And it was only a couple of years later, and the state passed Amendment 64 that legalized recreational marijuana and put us in the position of regulating that as well. So in Colorado, Department of Revenue has a number of enforcement agencies, one of which is the Marijuana Enforcement Division. I was the director of that division as we legalized marijuana within the state. I stayed there for roughly 6 years until I was promoted, and I oversaw casino gambling, liquor enforcement, and auto industry and racing along with marijuana when I left to start a company called Friedman and Koski, where my co-founder Andrew Friedman and I, we travel around the nation and we help government implement marijuana policy after a decision has already been made to move forward with that. And so we help with the implementation, policy development, and public engagement.
Great. Well, these are my friends from Colorado and from Maine. We've all been on this journey together for at least 5 or so years. Well, I just want to understand who's in the audience today. If you wouldn't be so kind as to raise your hand if you already have a medical or recreational system in your state. Okay, so that's virtually almost everyone. And then for those of you who don't have that system, I assume that you're here to either learn what to do or what not to do. Raise your hand on that front. So that includes everyone in the room. All right. Well, you know, one of the things that I've learned over the last 5 years, and the questions I get, of course, is what would you do differently if you had to do it over again, or what have you learned from your experience? If you're thinking about coming online with a system, whether it's medical or recreational, or if you're from a state and the politics are such that you say there is no way we will ever bring such a system into our jurisdiction. But you know, I'm just sort of curious what is going out in the world, or maybe there was another panel that you thought was more interesting or less, and that's why you're here. One of the things that Colorado didn't do, and frankly no state has done in any significant way, is measure the size of the black market prior to legalization of either medical or recreational. And the reason that's important is because the underlying premise of regulating cannabis is in part to provide access to patients and or provide consumers with the product. But at the end of the day, because this is a federally illegal substance, the proliferation of a black market has existed for 100 years. And many of the users that you have in your state account for a large quantity of consumption and purchase. But most folks, generally speaking, unlike alcohol, don't consume cannabis. And so the question that you have to answer to most folks is, I don't use cannabis. I don't have a medical or debilitating condition that requires it, or I'm not interested in consuming it recreationally. What does the legalization of cannabis, how does that benefit me? And I think the answer to that is, if you have the statistics and the data in place to measure the size of the black market at the front end, then over time, by definition, you will shrink that black market. And you can go and you can say to the taxpayers in your state, here's how much less resources we have to dedicate to police efforts, to investigative efforts, et cetera. And that, I think, in turn, helps to alleviate the concerns of those who are not interested in either using or consuming or permitting this type of product in the state. And so that would be the biggest thing that I would offer to all of you is, even if you're not going to start tomorrow in establishing a cannabis regulatory system, you ought to start measuring the data in your state tomorrow.
Good morning. I'm Theresa Purse. I'm the state representative from Maine. And in full disclosure, I'm a native Coloradoan. I was actually born in Colorado. Has nothing to do with the implementation of marijuana in Maine, but I am from there originally, and I proudly call Maine my home now, and happy to be here today to join you all. We legalized medical marijuana in Maine in 1999, and just last November legalized adult use marijuana. And in doing so, we realized that the referendum, which barely passed, it was 50 to 49%, had a lot of issues with it and inconsistencies and needed some work. So our legislature put together the Joint Select Committee on the Implementation of Marijuana. Don't think I don't get a lot of laughs around that table about the name of that. And that is a committee that's just in session, in our session in the 128th, which is this year and next year, to work on the statute and the legislation in order to implement this in the most effective and comprehensive way, keeping in mind the safety of our children and our communities sort of in the forefront. So this committee is 17 members. I am the chair of it, the House chair. You'll see on the screen in a little while some of other members of our committee who couldn't be here. And we represent all facets of the legislature. So there's a member of taxation, there's a member of judiciary, there's a member of criminal justice, there's a member, my standing committee is the education committee. And so I bring that perspective to the table in addition to like appropriations are on this committee. And we've been working with the referendum language in order to clean it up and maybe learn some lessons from other states, and then in order to implement something going forward. We have put a moratorium on retail use until February of 18, but you can have personal use right now legally in the state. So we're in a little bit of a in-between stage right now. It's been a fascinating experience. I was neither pro nor con on the passage of the referendum. I'm delighted to be part of the process because it's quite interesting. But it does pose a lot of challenges for states going forward. We did recently have a trip to Colorado to get lessons learned, and Andrew Friedman of Lewis's consulting firm did come and speak to our legislative committee as well. So I look forward to sharing some of that information a little later on, but that's who I am, and I'm delighted to be here.
Hi, I am Jordan Wellington. I am an associate attorney with the law firm Vicente Cederberg. I focus mostly on regulatory compliance and government affairs and public policy work. I cut my teeth as a bill drafter in the Office of Legislative Services in New Jersey. Actually, the guy I started is in the crowd mic over there on the same exact day, almost 7 years ago. I then relocated and moved with my family to Denver, Colorado, and was an aide in the House Majority Office when our legislative director told me that I was now going to be the staffer assigned to handle the implementation of marijuana legalization. I assumed that that meant there was like an army of people that I would be working with and all these other things, but unfortunately in Colorado there's like literally no legislative staff anywhere. And so I ended up being kind of the guy that did all this stuff with Representative Pavone through our Joint Select Committee. I guess I just can't stay away from the puns. And then, we carried the bills through the House together, and then they kicked me over to the Senate, and I carried the bills through the Senate. So by the end of the legislative session, and I always like to tell people in rooms like this that Representative Pabon, the legislature, myself, we got the bills through both houses of the Colorado legislature in 13 working days and didn't have to go to conference committee. So it's like one of my most proudest achievements of all. It's pretty dorky, but whatever, I like that stuff. After the session ended, I then was hired by the Marijuana Enforcement Division and got to work with my good friend Lou over there, and I was their policy nerd as well, and handled stakeholder engagement and drafted a lot of the regulations that govern medical and adult use cannabis in Colorado today. I eventually left public service and joined Vicente Cederberg, where as I mentioned, I run the firm's compliance department, advising clients all over the country on how to operate in compliance with a very complex web of regulations. I also work with VS Strategies, advising government clients and private sector clients on government affairs issues. And through the Council on Responsible Cannabis Regulation, I get to meet with legislators from really all over the world on how to do this responsibly, as well as get to do my favorite thing, which is lots of pro bono dorky policy work where we do a lot of, kind of have our own little think tank. And recently wrote a white paper on packaging and labeling that is really designed to allow states to conform both their regulations around packaging and labeling consistently with each other, which is very important, as well as be ready for the onset of federal legalization and what would happen when the FDA comes in and things like that. Finally, I am an adjunct professor of law at the University of Denver in Colorado, teaching a cannabis regulatory policy course. I'm the board president of the Core Network and the proud father of a 1-year-old.
Great, thank you everyone. And in case anyone needs a refresher, here's kind of the latest map across the country of cannabis legalization status, at least as of last Friday. things could have happened. We've been in Boston a few days. It's quite a patchwork across the country. All but 4 states currently have some sort of cannabis access law, and that ranges from the cannabidiol only, or the CBD only, or low THC products, to a traditional medical program, to full-on adult use legalization. And as a reminder, cannabis does remain a Schedule I product, seen as having no medical use, federally deeming it illegal in all forms. So just a quick history recap. Of the 8 states in DC that have adult use legalization, they also have marijuana medical programs. And 2 Western states legalized in 2012, that's Colorado and Washington. And then in 2014, DC came on with 2 other states, Alaska and Oregon. And then just last November, we had 4 states, California, Nevada, Massachusetts, and Maine, which were all done at the ballot box. 29 states, DC, and 2 other territories currently allow for medical only, and 17 states have those low THC or cannabidiol only product laws. And all of the adult use legalization efforts were citizen-driven ballot initiatives. No state legislature has yet to pass legislation to legalize adult use cannabis and have it signed by the governor. I hear you, Vermont. I know you're here. Vermont did pass that, but again, they did not hold something to try to veto the governor after that. So now we'll start the discussion portion of the session, and I'll kick it off with Representative Pabon. You sponsored some of the initial enacting legislation in Colorado, as we were already discussing. How would you say those regulations have changed from those initial efforts in 2013 to today? Are they largely the same, different, and if so, how so?
Back in 2013, we were pretty conservative, being one of the first states in the country and therefore the world to regulate cannabis. We started out very parochial, I guess I would say. We did things like made sure that no out-of-state residents could have essentially ownership or part of any type of cannabis business. Is very thoughtful approach. We wanted Colorado to sort of stay insulated from out-of-state interest, and so what happened almost by definition is the out-of-state interest went to other states and started their own programs, and so what we're seeing now, fast forward to 2017, 2018. There is a large interest of public companies being involved in the cannabis industry. It's just like any other industry. It just happens to regulate a federally illegal system, but with that minor point, the idea back then, and I think it's come true to fruition today, is we were really relying on the free market system to weed out, for lack of a better term, we knew there were criminals and cartels in the state of Colorado, and there are still to this day. We haven't gotten completely rid of the black market, but actually we started measuring it, and we know how good we're doing, and we're doing pretty well. But the way that many of us envisioned the regulatory system was that the free market would, in fact, separate out the good business owners from the bad business owners, and the bad business owners' practices would be relevant enough or obvious enough that the Marijuana Enforcement Division or the DEA or whomever it might be could go in and root out those bad actors. And that's happened. We've had very well-known busts recently in the state of Colorado, primarily due to a gray market issue that stemmed from our home grow caregiver operations. We've tamped down on that recently with some very good success. And so now, fast forward to 2017, we're looking at potentially allowing public companies to own operations in Colorado. At the beginning, if you were a tourist to Colorado, I won't ask anyone if you did, but if you were a tourist 5 years ago, you could only purchase a quarter ounce at a time. Now you can come to Colorado and purchase a full ounce. And that, again, was a conservative measure to make sure that folks weren't accumulating a lot of cannabis as tourists and then taking it back to their state. no other state, frankly, adopted that provision. And so in many ways, Colorado has had to adjust to the nationalization of cannabis regulation. But again, most folks do come to us because we have learned lessons, we've made adjustments, we've changed ownership structures and purchasing requirements. We also outlawed the use of animal shapes, fruit shapes, or human shapes in our edible products. That was something that we had started out with allowing completely, and it just got too confusing for many of the kids in Colorado. We saw an uptick in emergency room accidental ingestion, and so we went back and said, okay, that was a bad idea. We should prohibit those types of shapes in our edible format. So we've seen issues, and the good thing about Colorado is as the issues generally percolate, we address them pretty quickly and then share those lessons with all of you.
Great. Thank you. And the next question we'll have is for Lewis. As former director of the Marijuana Enforcement Division in Colorado, what were your initial challenges and how did they change while you were director? And what advice would you give to a new director or oversight official?
Thanks. For us, I think the biggest challenge in Colorado was being first, right? We actually had just this complete blank slate to work with in a lot of ways to make the implementation of both constitutional amendments and then laws that were coming down to the regulators from the General Assembly. We had really no other jurisdictions to go off of. I mean, one of the ways we solved for that problem was we borrowed from other similarly regulated industries. So in a lot of ways, our background investigations work. Some of our field enforcement was designed off of what casino gambling regulators do and for background investigations and vetting of individuals and companies to make sure they're in compliance with all the laws. And then on the field enforcement side, we borrowed a lot from liquor enforcement, especially as it relates to underage compliance and those types of things. The reality was, and as things came more into focus to us, is that marijuana is very unique in itself, and a lot of times it's not just as easy as being able to borrow from another similarly regulated industry to get you where you need to be to really address some of the issues that are unique to marijuana legalization. So that was one of the biggest challenges. I think the second biggest challenge for us was that there were some incredibly tight time frames that were put into the constitutional amendment for adult use, and it gave the regulators very little time to be able to actually create this brand new set of regulations where one hadn't existed before. And I have actually a whole new appreciation for policy nerdness that I picked up from Jordan as we're going through that process. But we actually spent like evenings almost at the office until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning working on getting those regulations done so we could get them done in time, so we could get rules promulgated and actually get businesses licensed by the time retail sales were intended to be started just a little over a year after the constitutional amendment was passed. And then again, the third biggest challenge was how divisive this was. Even though marijuana legalization through Amendment 64 had 100,000 more votes than President Obama did that year, it was still a divisive issue. 55% voted in favor, 45% voted against it. So you can see the battle lines are drawn almost immediately, and so we had to work up divisive policy issues. So challenges issued, though, I would say, or how the challenges changes, things came more into focus. There's really, and I think this is still true today, every unresolved policy issue on this is you can tie it either to the disparity between federal law and state law, or you can tie it to the fact that the science hasn't caught up with the policy yet. And so my advice for a new director would be is to make sure with all of these challenges that are out there is that you're engaging a wide variety of stakeholders to the process so you can ensure that those regulations are balanced, really focused on protecting public health and public safety, while at the same time ensuring that the job of the regulator is not to put the licensees out of business.
Thank you. And also, in case anyone in here might have a copy of Governing Magazine, there's a great story about Lewis's firm now on talking about the history of both he and Andrew's work and the Colorado level. So pick up a copy. Shameless plug. I'm not part of Governing Magazine. If this next question's for Jordan. As you mentioned before you joined the law firm, you were a policy wonk and still are a policy wonk. But what advice do you have for any legislative staff out there who are assigned to work on this topic for a legislator or a committee that, again, they come into it cold, they're not sure what to start with?
Yeah, I mean, first, I think I'd riff off something Representative Pabon mentioned, which is, and as well as Lou, is kind of like, first and foremost, what are the precedents for this? Cannabis is kind of unique in the sense that it's federally illegal and people kind of stick it in every single thing you could possibly imagine, but it's going to react like a commodity and like any other commodity. So the laws of supply and demand and all of these basic things that you would do in any business regulatory structure will be applicable for cannabis. So I just wanted to kind of get that out there. I think first and foremost, I would tell them to get ready to drink from the fire hose. For me, being able to work on this is like been kind of a dream come true because it's one of the most interesting and fascinating policy subjects I've been able to work on. It just covers a tremendous amount of ground, from agricultural regulation and regulations of farming and things like that, all the way to complex manufacturing, sales, testing. I never thought I would have to understand the federal government's process for certifying child-resistant packaging. I never thought I'd have to understand the process for approving different types of pesticides and how that works. Now I'm an expert in both of them, unfortunately. But it basically is this like never-ending series of rabbit holes that you have to run down because whether it's federal prohibition that kind of makes it so that the FDA or the EPA is not actively doing the role that they are, or literally just within one agency, the Marijuana Enforcement Division, regulating agricultural production, complex manufacturing and extraction, infusion into everything from, it's edible products to sexual lubricant and suppositories and every other weird thing you could possibly imagine. I got to have a conversation with someone at the Marijuana Enforcement Division about whether infused sexual lubricant was an edible product or not. That was one of the more fascinating days of my career. If you have if you keep an open mind and you have a good sense of humor, you can really enjoy working in this area. And then. With that open mind, you kind of never really know where the most important ideas are going to come from. We have a particular stakeholder in Colorado that will go unmentioned that can be quite challenging from time to time. But in one particular working group meeting, she mentioned concentrate production as being a very dangerous and unregulated part of the industry. And that really led us, Lou and I, to create the first ever set of kind of concentrate production regulations for cannabis, which really mirror just basic fire code and building safety stuff. But it wasn't ever done before, and it wasn't until this random offhand comment in a meeting that we thought about it. And that thread of being able to pay attention and keep your mind open runs from these basic ideas about how you're going to regulate things all the way through kind of the efficacy of medical cannabis. The latest stuff that's really interesting around potential applications in dermatology and things like that are things that I don't think anybody ever thought of when we started going down this road. But I guess so. Keep your mind open and get ready to drink from the fire hose are my two top pieces of advice.
Great, thank you. Representative Purse, as we mentioned, some of the main Joint Select Committee members were just in Colorado last week, and you were there to learn from the legislators and regulators firsthand, as well as folks from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. How did that experience inform your upcoming duties to create initial regulations in Maine, and what was maybe some of the most surprising things or useful things you learned about?
Thank you. Yeah, it was 4 members of the committee took a reconnaissance trip to Colorado, for lack of a better word, and Representative Pabon and a few other representatives there, and NCSL organized it for us. So if your state, I think, is embarking on this and hasn't voted it in yet or isn't all the way through, or even if you're in the middle of it, I highly encourage you to take a trip or invite people to your state for the conversation, because we certainly learned a lot. I did not have as fascinating discussions as Jordan does, but I would say that the takeaways that we had that are now really involved and are informed our committee decisions are just a couple things. Number one, the personal use issue. People who want to play in the regulated market buy their licenses and play in that market, but we found through Colorado that they had a loophole in the personal use, that things could be growing not regulated at all and have a lot of plants on sites, and that was causing a lot of problems in Colorado. Our law is similar to that as it stands now, so we're looking to amend that to change it, to limit the number of plants that you can have on a parcel. What was happening in Colorado is residential areas were becoming populated because of this this personal use that then escalated along with the medical use, and we're trying to learn from that and move forward in a better manner. There's lively conversation in our committee about this because it's all about your personal liberty to use it, and the law says that you can, while also taking into concern the safety of communities and the rights of other individuals in that community. So it's a very robust conversation about those two things. The other real big component had to do with pesticides. I think Colorado set up and other people have mentioned this before, has set up their testing sort of later in the game. We're trying to get it earlier in the game analysis done of that and get our testing sites up and going, because we want the product to be safe when it goes to product. But if you don't allow testing facilities to come online earlier, sometimes that can bottleneck. It happened in a couple of other states as well. And then what pesticides and what you're measuring in the contaminants. If you do that up front when people can expect it, that's a little easier transition. The data collection has come up before as well. Data collection is expensive to do, but it informs future policy decisions. And we learned a lot from our counterparts in Colorado around what the black market looks like currently so that you can measure that, but also other things like you mentioned visits to emergency rooms and things that might fluctuate, or you can show pattern that then you can have informed policy decision going forward to change and improve the safety of the use of the product. And then the other great thing that I think Colorado did, but it took them multiple times at trying maybe to get the right voice out there. They have a great public health campaigns around this issue. They have the Good to Know campaign, which is for adults and adult use, and tourism, which you don't really think about when you get involved in this. I always thought, oh, people might come to Maine to use pot, but I really think of the water and the ocean as being the first thing that you come to Maine for. But people, I guess, do travel, and when they show up, they do this, but they're not maybe experienced users, and problems can ensue as you can find. And then also with the campaigns that they used around youth and youth prevention, trying to, I have a 17-year-old, not a 1-year-old, and the mind of a 17-year-old who thinks that nothing will ever go wrong in their life. You have to have a different kind of campaign around that. And I thought some of the most interesting data that we learned from Colorado was youth view tobacco and alcohol as dangerous and bad for your health and bad for your brain and bad for your body, but they don't see cannabis or marijuana that way right now. And I think that that's an interesting dynamic, and one that we should really look at about how to have people not start using this adult product until they are 21 and over adults. So that's just a couple things we took away. It was a great visit. NCSL did a fantastic job organizing our trip out there, and we had great people showing us around. And I know a lot of you went and saw Fenway last night, but thanks to Representative Pavone, I got to see Coors Field and behind the scenes there, so that was quite a treat as
And
well.
we'll throw that in if you come on out and make that part of the trip.
I did not pay Representative Purse to say such nice things about us, but we
That was
do appreciate it.
Very, very well done.
All right, and then as we mentioned, we have a couple comments for some other legislators that were on the fact-finding mission that were not able to make it with us today.
I think I've learned that despite the best efforts of everybody involved, there's still 2/3 of the counties in Colorado which have chosen not to participate in the legal market, that is, chosen not to license cultivators or production facilities or retail facilities. I think we all have an interest in wanting to make sure that this legal market actually is out there in all parts of our state, so that we don't have these vast deserts where people have no alternative if they want to buy than to go through the illegal market. So it's been a challenge for Colorado. We know it's going to be a challenge for us.
And that is Senator Cates, who is the other co-chair of the Joint Select Committee. The most surprising thing. And this is Senator Mark Dion. Okay, Senator Cates, how have you been approaching the issue of state taxation?
Well, we are far from completing our work, but our current thinking is that we're probably going to have both a sales tax at the end user level and also some sort of an excise tax earlier in the process when cultivators sell their product to the next step. And we're operating in the area of discussion of around 20% on both of those, a total of 20%, somewhere in the middle of what other states have done. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we don't want to end up with a situation where a high tax is sending people to the black market. On the other hand, we have all sorts of needs in Maine, as every state does, to the extent that this new tax revenue can help us with some of our general fund programs, where we have an appetite for that, for sure. We have decided that a portion of the tax is going to go back to the municipalities where the marijuana activity took place. We're also going to devote a small portion of the taxation to public safety issues, particularly helping to train law enforcement officers more in good drug recognition practices for the highways. And we're also going to devote a portion of it to public safety campaigns, public health campaigns, particularly related to youth use, with most of the remaining money probably going into the general fund.
Okay, and this next one is Senator Dion. And can you describe how you've worked bipartisanly on this issue in Maine?
How we've worked on it bipartisan. It's really, in 1999, when I was a sheriff, I led the campaign for medicinal marijuana. And I went first to the Capitol to see if we could do it as a bill. And I remember addressing Republicans and trying to underscore that this was a state rights issue so they would join the fray. And to the Democrats, I told them it was compassionate liberalism. And I tried to broker a marriage oh so long ago. Well, ironically, those two themes remain in place. My Republican colleagues recognize it's a state's responsibility to implement the will of the people. I think my Democratic colleagues are cognizant that we have a mature medicinal marijuana community and they want to protect those interests. And it's been very collaborative. I mean, it's not, I think leadership of both parties made good selections as to committee membership, and we've really tried to address this as a community issue, and that there isn't a Republican way or a Democratic way to solve this. It's going to have to be a unified consensus. As a matter of fact, our two chairs are committed to consensus. I mean, they drive our efforts, and as individual members, we've tried to satisfy that. Interestingly, it's been new themes like libertarianism and what that means to this kind of discussion, and the idea of civil liberties. It's been on policy and not on party, and I'm real proud of that, real proud.
So as we just heard from some of the additional state Maine legislators, taxes seem to be one of the most important issues that is talked about when you talk about marijuana regulation and legalization. And this is for Representative Pabon. Can you tell us a bit about Colorado's experience with the tax issue and how much they play a role to fund regulation or other specific items like enforcement?
Yeah, and again, this question is both about taxation, but also how do you justify spending time, resources, energy in this space to those who have no interest in using or consuming or otherwise familiar with cannabis. And so the tax piece is an important one. First and foremost, we intentionally put in an excise tax of 15% to make sure that, one, we met our constitutional requirements of dedicating $40 million to the construction of rural school buildings. And we have done that for the first time. It takes a while to build up your sales to that level, but we have collected $40 million for the construction of rural schools. In addition, we added a 10% special sales tax, and in Colorado, the counties and municipalities can also add their own tax And so many do either both a sales tax or an excise tax. But one of the most important principles we followed, and this is unlike both, generally speaking, alcohol and cigarette taxes, which are considered sin taxes. And sin taxes are set up to disincentivize a purchaser from consuming a particular product, particularly true with tobacco. We wanted to make sure that our tax structure was not set up as a disincentive to consumption, so not a sin tax, but rather a tax that would allow us to do two things. One, to fully pay for the regulatory system that has cost us many, many millions of dollars through the Marijuana Enforcement Division. Louis Koski got a raise out of all this. I'm just kidding. I don't know if that's actually true, but it's funny.
It's actually not.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think that is true. But to pay for lawyers like Jordan Wellington and many, many other regulators in this space. Unlike what we do in Colorado, and I'm sure this is true of your states as well, alcohol is in part funded by the general fund. The oversight, the licensing, the regulation is all funded by the general fund. In Colorado, that is not true for cannabis. It pays for itself. So one of the criticisms that we can all get is, why are you using my taxpayer dollars to pay for this system that I have nothing to do with? Well, the answer is we're not. We're using consumers who pay for the product and or cultivators who cultivate the product to fund the system. And that is actually the highest priority of funding we have. After we pay for the regulation, the regulators and the systems we have a seed to sale tracking system like many of you are all talking about, and you have bids from 3 or 4 vendors to take advantage of it. That's all paid for by our excise and sales tax revenue as well. And then we move into the next tier of public health campaigns, youth use, educating consumers, public safety, and so on and so forth. And one of the issues that I think is sort of bubbling up in Colorado is we did have this campaign to fund education at, as I said before, $40 million to our rural school funds. But what's interesting, and you know, voters are savvy in many ways, but oftentimes you know, forget the we are going to fund education in rural Colorado, and just here we are going to fund education. And so they have, you know, 3.5 million students or Coloradans live in urban areas, which is which is roughly 70% of the population. And so what they're saying is, I don't see any tax benefit from the regulation of cannabis. How is this impacting me? And one of the things that we're only starting to do better is educate the public about how those taxes are being used and utilized to improve their overall quality of life. Because again, this is a very narrow topic. The media loves this topic, by the way, and we have a whole industry of publications in Colorado that talk about this every day. The Denver Broncos, the weather, and cannabis are the top 3 stories in that order, basically. So, you know, but what we don't do a good job about is talking about the positives that are produced from the regulation of cannabis, which again the media is less interested in. They like to see the controversy, the foibles, the mistakes, the letters from Jeff Sessions to the Governor Hickenlooper and everyone else. But you know, there's never a story that says taxes have benefited the people of Colorado in a significant way.
Thank you. And this is going to be for Louis. Before you were the director of the Marijuana Enforcement Division, you were in law enforcement. And what can you say to the role of law enforcement and including them in policy discussions and creation? And have you seen that in other states as you've been advising other clients?
Well, thanks. I think a lot of times, I've spent my whole adult life in law enforcement, and I think a lot of times we view law enforcement as this monolithic group that advocates for the same things, that their interests are always aligned. And I'm not sure that's true. I think generally when it comes to marijuana legalization, certainly it's safe to assume that for the most part, law enforcement really questions the wisdom behind marijuana legalization. They certainly do, and they tend to lean more towards the anti-legalization mindset, but they do so to differing degrees. And so getting them involved in the policy process can be a challenge because on one hand, you're going to have a group of law enforcement that is just completely inconsolable about marijuana legalization. And then you're going to have other groups that within law enforcement that may take a little different approach and that are a little more open-minded to medical marijuana and some of the benefits that they see from that. And then others that may be even a little bit more open to the concept of legalization. But I think what law enforcement looks for more than anything, again, with a broad generalization, is they're looking for some clarity. And that's not necessarily an easy thing to achieve. So getting them engaged in that process of the policymaking, both at the legislature and the regulatory side, is really critical. And we did this in a couple of different ways in Colorado. One is we actually created, and we helped facilitate this meeting with the Chiefs Association, was we created a law enforcement working group where it was an opportunity, it was a private setting where the regulators on the Department of Revenue side could meet with law enforcement, both chiefs and sheriffs, and if federal law enforcement was interested, they participated as well, where they could actually have an opportunity to really talk through some of the biggest challenges that they saw. And it was kind of interesting when we started that work group on the medical side. Law enforcement saw, at least in Colorado, saw medical as a kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge for legalization because chronic pain was one of our ailments, and it was also the most popular ailment that you could get a medical license or medical registration patient card for, and it was relatively easy to get. As we transitioned out of the medical side and into the retail side, where we're having a real honest argument, adult use is so adults can use marijuana and get high. It actually kind of eased some of that tension with law enforcement because they saw it as a real honest argument. This is exactly what we're doing. You guys want to use it to get high, great. And they were a little bit more inclined to participate in the policy process because it was out there in the open and it was just a real honest argument. Whereas before they were sometimes a little reluctant to get involved in that process because they almost saw it as saying it's a thumbs up to, and kind of were afraid it was going to be viewed as them advocating for legalization. So. The other thing that we did just real quick in Colorado is we saved places on the public work group. So as we talked through some of the most difficult policy issues like production management and edibles and those types of things, we made sure that we had reserved places on those public work groups so we could get members of law enforcement community at the table and advocating for things that they thought were important within the policy.
Thank you. And then we also have another comment from Senator Dion in Maine on this issue. You have a former history of being in law enforcement, and how has your perspective from the law enforcement side helped inform your positions on this and your thoughts on this going forward as a legislator?
Well, I'm smiling because under the dome I'm still referred to as the sheriff. Senator seems to be an incidental, but I did spend 32 years in law enforcement. And I think I function as a bridge person to the community of police officers and prosecutors in terms of trying to make sure their questions are being answered and their concerns are being addressed. And I think I could distill that to the whole issue of impaired driving. Long ago, I think practitioners in criminal justice had a wink and nod that they knew the continued war on drugs was not working as applied to cannabis. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a concern, and a legitimate one at that, as to what impaired drivers mean as a threat to the general public safety. So in my work on the implementation committee, I've tried to make sure that we're going to address that by directing revenues towards training and equipment, modifying our impaired drunk driving laws to incorporate the threat that overindulgence or inappropriate indulgence of cannabis might pose to the motoring public. That said, we all agree, we know the questions, the answers will take some time to develop. So I think that's what I bring to the table given my career history.
Okay, the next question I have is for Jordan. And right now, you're more in the role of advising cannabis-based clients and other state governments on regulation issues. What can you share with us, obviously without breaking any attorney-client privileges? What are those new states learning from the old states? Like, what are the most major themes that you're coming across?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So two kind of general things and then some specific questions. So, first there's kind of questions about where we can learn things from, and I think the lesson is try not to invent new policy. I mentioned child-resistant packaging laws. The federal government has them, just use them. My favorite example is the universal symbol. It's a concept we kind of, I think, started in Colorado where there would be one symbol on all cannabis products. Lots of other states were like, wow, that's a great idea. And then they made up their own universal symbol, making it not universal. So if there's going to be a universal symbol, use the same one across the country. Second, something that we've seen a lot of is kind of ratcheting up regulation for political purposes. It's kind of good politics to say we have the most restrictive regulatory system in the country. The advice there is essentially pretty straightforward. It leads to bad policy. And what I like to say is that every dollar and every second spent complying with a regulation that doesn't actually protect public health or safety is a dollar and second that is not being spent on a regulation that actually does protect public health and safety. Bad regulations are not, they're a net negative. They're not a zero sum, right? To be really specific, people ask a lot about edible regulation. I think Colorado, for the most part, has done a very good job. There's probably some disagreements around some particular things, but especially our work on segmentation has been really important. There's other policy proposals from around the country that are particularly important and fascinating. Oregon has done a great job with the implementation and importation of new strains into the system, so that if there's a particularly popular strain in the black market, there's a way to bring it into the regulated market. Supply and demand, right? You want the consumers to go to the regulated market. California's done a great job with environmental regulation. Massachusetts and Oregon have done work on micro cultivation to allow to kind of what I refer to as indigenous cultivation into the regulated system. And the white paper I talked about before that we wrote on packaging and labeling. People also ask a lot about youth use, crime, and education campaigns. We hear kind of all over the country. In fact, when I was in Delaware about 2 months ago to testify at their legalization hearing, about a dozen people before me testified about the hellscape that Colorado had become and all these terrible things about our state, and none of them had ever been there before. So, come visit Colorado. If Colorado was a hellscape, it'd probably be on the evening news around the country. It's not. It's a beautiful, wonderful city like every other city in America. Educational campaigns are great. I think we kind of had a big misstep at the outset and are now, our Good to Know campaign has kind of become nationally renowned as a very good way to do this. I think the lesson there is to be really respectful. The initial kind of educational campaigns were very disrespectful to people in the cannabis community. And if you're trying to message to people who consume cannabis, starting out by insulting them and calling them stupid and making jokes about rat cages probably wasn't the best way to start. And then I'd also like to point out that there's a lot of concern about diversion and diversion out from Colorado. I like to think about things from a very realistic and economic perspective. If there is black market cannabis from Colorado ending up in another state, it is likely because that state does not have a regulated system of production and distribution of its own. Essentially, it's not Colorado's fault. This is basic supply and demand in economics. People are going to go to places where there's less kind of potential punishment, and if there's demand for Colorado-grown cannabis in New York, and they're willing to pay top dollar for it, this is America. Someone's going to find a way to send that to them, and that really collective regulation of cannabis is the only solution to address the black market issues.
Thank you for that. This last question that's going to be addressed for the whole panel, you all can chime in as you're interested in answering it. Based on what we currently know about federal agencies looking closely at states with legalized cannabis programs and other interests at the federal level, how do you see states reacting to any change in federal law enforcement practices? And I'll start with Representative Pabon if he has any thoughts first.
Yeah, Colorado received a letter from Jeff Sessions about 10 days ago, which frankly was copied and pasted from a letter he sent to Washington and a couple of other jurisdictions, citing statistics that were maintained by the High Intensity Drug Task Force that is relevant to each region in the country. And here's the challenge, and here's the thing about all these different statistics, anecdotes, stories that you hear about every jurisdiction. You know, you can make up any conclusions about any data you want anytime you want, and so you can manipulate, change, not change, but manipulate the overall statistical significance of pretty much anything, and to suit your political needs and background. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. You know, one of the big questions is about youth use increase in Colorado, and statistically, you have seen a flat line, no increased youth use in Colorado since the advent of legalization. Jeff Sessions sent a letter saying we've seen an increase in youth use based on our reports, but the problem is we're all looking at the same reports, and so I think the challenge here, and this is kind of higher level, is that good policy makes good politics, and ingrained in, we spent a lot of time talking about regulation and how to regulate a system, but at the end of the day, we're still doing so within a political system, and there are folks who are against the proliferation of either a medical or recreational cannabis system, including a lot of overtures from the current administration. And so what do we do in response to that? The answer is we keep doing what we've always been doing, which is to use the Cole memo as our points of reference, which means keeping this out of the hands of kids, criminals, and cartels, preventing youth access, ensuring that we have a well-regulated tracking system that we've always had from the beginning. And frankly, I don't think that there's a lot that we could do from a regulatory point of view to deal with the political reality of this conversation. And so from a policy point of view, Colorado is certainly ready and willing and able to have a discussion about if there are further policies that are needed to, again, cut the black market, prevent youth access. But from a political point of view, that's something that can't be resolved without some changes in the politics of this substance.
Anyone else? Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah. So I think I think a lot of times everybody is concerned with what the federal government's next step under a new administration, what they're going to do, and I think a lot of times they focus on whether or not a new enforcement policy is going to be directed right at the industry. And I think if it was, I think that would be really concerning. And I think there's good reason for people to be concerned about what direction that's going to head at the federal level. But when I look at this really practically, like especially if I look at it from my background, which is an enforcement background, I think there's also some opportunity there for states to actually work a little bit more closely with the federal government on this issue, because even though we call it legalization, there's still a lot of potential criminal activity that could be happening within a state, whether it's diversion of marijuana outside of the regulatory system and into other states, or it's there's a large unregulated population where criminals can operate without the normal enforcement risk that they would have. There's opportunities there for the federal government to relook at the Cole memo and say, well, maybe we can just increase our monitoring and enforcement within the confines of the status quo, not necessarily focus those efforts towards the regulated community, but really focus towards the criminal activity that is still occurring. And so I think that that's where the sweet spot or the opportunity lies there for the federal government, who incidentally has really limited resources to completely come after a large industry that's operating in a number of different states across the country, and really focus on those areas where criminal enforcement is still needed, and they can act as a force multiplier for local jurisdictions that could use some of their help getting a handle on some of those things.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any thoughts? Oh, go ahead, Representative Purse.
Yeah, I will just say in Colorado, this came up because we are about ready to try to go online, and what's going to happen. Our referendum happened at the same time as the election, and I think we just decided that the Cole memo was a good way to be an outline to how we would pursue things. And until something actually happened, we weren't going to spend. There's so much other items and other areas to spend time and energy on as a committee and as a state, that to worry about what ifs while we were trying to get our own system up and going, that it felt like that was not good energy to spend. And so we do follow the Cole memo pretty clearly, and use that sort of as our barometer at the moment. Obviously, if things change, we'll have to adjust course, but at this point, who knows what will happen, right? And if you look at the map that you just saw, they're swimming in a stream. They're going against the stream there a little bit. So we'll see.
I would just add very briefly, if this is something that your state's doing, don't make it easy on them to come in and intervene. So, this letter came out to all of these states, and it had all these allegations of facts that, were kind of very dissimilar to a lot of the other data that's come out. And, Colorado had recently met with the Department of Justice and given a very long presentation about all the great work that we're doing and all the exceptional policies that have been adopted and all the hard work that we've put in. And then magically those 140 pages worth of PowerPoints came out kind of around the same time, right? To say, hey, there is a narrative that's not being told in this letter. And so I think if you can, don't allow, a group of people that kind of have their minds made up before they look at an issue to control the data, to control the narrative, and states have collected their own data, and the proof is kind of in the pudding. Show the work that we've done, show the tax revenue. Colorado, between taxes and fees, just broke the $500 million mark. It's a heck of a lot more than we've spent on regulation. Do not allow an administration that's become quite good at controlling narratives to control a narrative to make claims about your state that are, quite frankly, not true.
Thank you. Okay, now is the fun time for Q&A. We have two mic rovers in the audience, the lovely Margaret and the Mr. Eric. Handsome Eric, okay, fine. And if you have a question, just raise your hand and they'll run the mics to you. So we ask that you be patient. We'll take as many questions as we can, but then we will have one last quick bonus round question at the end for the panelists.
I just have a really quick question. I'm from Maryland. I'm a patient advocate. And I wondered if you could speak to the role of patient advocates on your working group, and also how you address the medical refugees that are flocking into Colorado.
I mean, we have patient advocates on pretty much all of the working groups that we have in Colorado. Frankly, I think the medical refugee issue is becoming less and less so as more states come online with a medical system. I think the challenge that we have as a country is when strains are unique to a particular state, and there's not access in other states, then folks have to come to Colorado. And I think that is why, one amongst many reasons, the federal government should decriminalize and potentially deschedule cannabis for everyone.
Rennie Cushing from New Hampshire, and I have a question about the impact that existing medical marijuana operations have when a state moves toward adult recreational use. How do the incumbent companies fare, or what role do they play in that? And is there conflicts that arise when you have both a medical scheme and adult recreational use?
I'll jump in here. States have handled that differently. In Colorado, we started with medical commercialization first, and so we were pretty far along the path to licensing medical businesses by the time retail marijuana was passed. and a lot of that was resolved to a certain extent at the legislature initially, where they created this window where the only the only ones who could participate initially in adult use were ones that were licensed by the Marijuana Enforcement Division for medical, and so they were able to transition into the retail. And then it was like 9 months down the road from that, we started accepting applications for new businesses that didn't necessarily have to have a medical marijuana license. That transition actually was pretty smooth for us. In fact, it really enabled us to meet some of those really tough deadlines that I talked about earlier. Washington State did it a little differently, where they started with a brand new recreational marketplace, while I think what was a less regulated industry on the medical side was onboarded into the regulated system, I think a year or so down the road. And I think they may have experienced some of the same challenges we did initially licensing medical businesses because they were already operational. And so I guess the take home for that is to the extent that a state can start fresh with brand new licensees and you're not regulating an industry that's already been operating in an unregulated capacity, try and do that, because it's exponentially harder to bring on a operating industry into a regulated environment than it is starting from scratch. I think we'll see that play out a little bit in California, where they have a very large industry that's already operating there, that's regulated at the local level primarily, and they're onboarding all of those businesses into a state system now.
And this is where politics comes in, because there was actually a pretty big move by the legacy medical cannabis industry to have a large, lengthy moratorium. Initially, they argued for 3 years before any new licensees could enter into the market. And that was in tension with the idea of the free market system basically allowing us to ferret out the bad actors. If we had given the medical cannabis industry 3 years instead of 9 months, then it's easier to have an anchor or a monopoly, essentially, in a particular state, and more difficult than to ferret out the good and bad actors using a free market system. So we dialed that back significantly to 9 months. But there was a lot of political pressure to extend that moratorium as long as possible.
And I think it's worth mentioning that this wasn't done for protectionist purposes from the legislature's perspective. It was really the idea that that 9-month window really allowed the Marijuana Enforcement Division to ratchet up and resolve problems, right? It dealt with a known population first, dealt with licensing for those individuals, got all of those background investigators and everyone else much more accustomed to the new regulatory structure, and then allowed it. So it was much more of a good government type of policy than just economic protectionism.
And in Maine, we're opening up the market to both. But if you want to move from medical into adult rec, you apply into it and go through that criteria based. And that will, if you're a good player in the medical and you want to move over, your application will be easier and you'll move forward. And we sort of learned a little bit from that. So we're taking a little different approach to that.
Thank you. I think we have a question in the back.
Sure. The legacy of the war on drugs has kind of led to mass incarceration in a lot of Black and brown communities across the country. How do we make sure that communities of color who have kind of suffered the brunt of the criminal justice kind of burden of marijuana, how do we make sure that they share the economic benefits of legalization? And then how do we also look at those low-level, nonviolent drug offenders and consider whether or not we resentence or re-adjudicate their offenses?
And that's exactly the right question to ask. Right before this, I was with the National Hispanic Conference of State Legislators, passing a resolution advocating for the inclusion of communities of color in the legalization process. Primarily, that issue comes down to capital access and the ability for states to essentially look at state interest first over out-of-state interest. And Colorado honestly did that. So we have, I think, per capita, higher ownership amongst communities of color than most other states. Many other states require large bond or capital requirements, $1 million to $5 million. By definition, that's going to tend to give more weight to well-financed individuals. On the criminal justice piece, we are as the National Hispanic Conference of State Legislators are advocating for decriminalization at both the federal and the state level once a program is adopted, and as importantly, a systematic record sealing policy in place so that behavior that was previously illegal that is now legal, those records can be sealed almost as a matter of course, not having to file a petition and go through a very lengthy and expensive process. I think there's many different lenses through which to look at this issue. We have not talked about the civil rights issue very much on this panel because it's focused on the regulatory piece, but I think bigger picture, civil rights issues, medical access, and patient issues and efficacy, taxation issues are all different lenses that everyone can come to the same conclusion that the regulation of cannabis is good for a particular state or a community.
I think that, you know, this is probably one of the most important policy areas that needs to kind of continue to see fervent development. We've seen some kind of policy development in California around this, but it's really focused on the idea that like licenses are going to be issued on a one-to-one basis for different kind of census tracts or different kind of specific communities. I think it's led to a lot of kind of the use of straw men and things like that. And we feel very strongly that there's another way to go about doing this, and that is, I think, as Representative Pabon alluded to, removal of barriers to entry. This is largely an economic issue. If you look at cannabis regulation, you know, there's kind of a lot of drivers of cost. So a lot of the East Coast states have state limitations on the number of licenses that can be issued, and it costs millions and millions of dollars to simply apply for a license by the time you're done paying your consultants and your lawyers and your everybody else. And so obviously, you know, that's going to create a massive barrier to entry. In other states where the state doesn't limit licenses and the locals don't limit licenses, it's just a zoning issue. If you can find a location that is suitable, you can put a business there. There are massive barriers to entry there as well. You're talking about a security system that'll cost one of our clients anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 up to $500,000. You're talking about a very expensive seed-to-sale tracking system that not only does the business need to use and operate, but literally many have one or multiple full-time employees literally dedicated to doing nothing but inputting data for states to monitor. And so it basically, the regulatory structure as it's put together today is makes it more or less impossible for anyone from you know, the lower end of the socioeconomic scale to run a cannabis business. And you know, the thing that needs to be done to resolve that is the same thing that we would do in any other industry. Removal of barriers to entry. We've been working with a couple of different states as well as some U.S. territories on a policy that we like to call micro-cultivation, where you allow a more de minimis amount of cultivation to occur than you would at a large commercial facility, you know, essentially something that you could feed a family of 4 or 5 on. And then you ratchet down all of these incredibly expensive regulatory requirements because they are not cultivating a large scale of cannabis. And without those removals of barriers to entry, I think it's going to be very hard to, you know, resolve this issue.
It's interesting too, because this barrier to participation is a big topic in Maine. We consider ourselves the farm basket of New England, and we see a lot of people see cannabis as the plant, and wanting to keep this sort of micro industry going, almost like craft brewery kind of thing. And so we actually scaled down our tiering quite significantly comparatively to other states so that people could access it at a smaller level, be indoor or outdoor. But you still need security. You still, you know, it's an industry. It's not your local farm stand, although there are comments in my state of it's God's plan, just have it at the farm stands, and then you, of course, get the complete opposite, like you've got to have a fortress around it. So it's an interesting policy decision, and it's a very interesting political conversation.
Okay, we have time for one more question from the audience, and then we're going to have one quick wrap up here, and then we'll be done. So go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I'm Ed Butler from New Hampshire, and you talk about those states, those of us who don't have a regulation or laws yet, needing to access and use black market statistics. What exists and what needs to, how do we access or improve the ability to get that information and use it?
So your local law enforcement can certainly share either anecdotally or statistically, the number of arrests that have occurred for, marijuana possession, cultivation, et cetera. That's a good start to sort of building a base for statewide data. But if New Hampshire's anything like Colorado, we're really good at keeping very local jurisdiction-specific data, but building it into a bigger statewide database that would allow us to really, analyze and run some regression analysis is not as good. So we spent on the front end around $250,000 to put together a statewide system so that all this jurisdictional data could be combined and put into a report. There are a couple of consultants in the world who do regression analysis for you as well, so you can, there's a consultant for everything in the world, right? So, so those who study black market activity are, doing well right now. But that gives you a really good basis for understanding. And then, if you're going to go ahead and do that, you might as well look at what your current youth use rate is in New Hampshire. We have a Colorado Kids Count healthy study that sort of gives us a lot of that data. But again, combining it into and putting it into a series of reports or information that everyone can look to and use as a point of reference. It doesn't have to be the end-all be-all, but it certainly can serve as a useful guide for you. Because maybe you look at the data and you say, our black market's just not that big. Folks are coming from Rhode Island or Maine or wherever else, Vermont, and so we don't need to, regulate this. That's a perfectly acceptable conclusion, but you don't know what you're dealing with until you actually measure the size of the problem that you have. And again, no state has really done that super well, but as states are getting more and more sophisticated in their data collection process, they are.
All right, so in closing, I have what I like to call the bonus round, and we're just going to ask each speaker to give their top nugget of wisdom, which they haven't already mentioned, or if they just really want to emphasize one particular point of their best advice for other legislators and regulators working on this issue. So, and then for Representative Purse, she can also just chime in for the newer legislators on this issue too. So, go ahead, Louis.
I think probably my biggest piece of advice would be that action is better than inaction. As we've had the last 7 months, had the privilege of really traveling across the country and meeting with government agencies all over the place, both state and local, we're starting to recognize some trends that help states implement, so some signs that implementation is going to go well. And one of the primary ones is support and some level of cooperation amongst the elected officials in that state, whether it be the governor's office or the state legislatures. The more they work closely together, the more they take on the task that's been given to them, oftentimes from a voter initiative of some sort, the more likely there is going to be success. Now, there's other things too that are important to it, where, for example, the coordination of efforts between executive branch agencies who are going to be tasked with doing the heavy lifting to get everything implemented. Another big indication is the ability of government to really honestly engage with the public, not just because they think it's a checkbox that they have to mark on their way to implementation, but actually facilitating really good conversations to arrive at balanced policy. And so just kind of going back, the elected official support is where all of that starts. So if you have that tier working together or taking action, even if it's not the perfect policy alternatives right now, they're not in focus, still acting on it's better than not.
So a panel of this sort, let alone 3 panels dedicated to cannabis at an NCSL conference 5 years ago would have been unheard of, and all of us would have been laughed off stage, and Carmen might have been fired for suggesting it. The world is changing around us. I can tell you in Colorado, Lewis alluded to the fact that legalization was more popular than Barack Obama in 2012. I voted no on the amendment, in most part because being a guinea pig in this particular area wasn't something I wanted Colorado to necessarily be, and I grew up in the state and I love my state, and so I want it to be known more for mountains and outdoorsmanship than marijuana. Now we're known for both, and so. But my thoughts and my feelings on this issue have evolved tremendously, and I think that's probably the key takeaway. Two key takeaways from this. One, your constituents are generally much more open to this proposition than your elected bodies. By definition, we are a more conservative body, not in the Republican sense, but in just, we don't want to get too far out in front of our constituencies. And I can tell you, your constituencies are already far out in front of you. National polling, local jurisdiction polling tell you that either a medical or a recreational system is something that many of your constituencies want. And 2, I think the evolution of this policy happens by definition over time. You will meet children who are suffering from epilepsy in your state who tell you they either came to Colorado or are using the black market because a cannabis strain or a CBD strain stops those 1,000 seizures in a given time period to 3 or 4, and that the quality of life has changed. You will hear from those who suffer from cancer or other debilitating pain diseases who have found alleviation of their pain and chronic conditions through this product. You will hear from communities of color talking about it being a civil rights issue, and so the topic itself is much broader and much more interesting than certainly I ever thought it would be, and my newest focus is on the research and the science development around cannabis. The federal government has a very active and intentional policy to essentially stifle research and science development on this plant. It's rooted in 100 years of history, and that 100 years of history is hard to overcome. But as the states in a federalism system, in the 10th Amendment, and I'm a Democrat, and I know more about the 10th Amendment now than I did 5 years ago, and I'm a believer, it's our role to sort of push the federal government when we need to, and I think this is one of those opportunities. Let me just say one quick thing. I realized that I left my cards in my hotel, so I'm just going to say this for all of you and the people at home. My email is dan.pabon, my last name, Pabon, house@state.co.us. And please send me an email, come out to Colorado, take a visit, and we'll help you learn about what we did.
So it's always great to go third, because the first thing I was going to talk about is the intersection between the executive and the legislature in order to get this up and running, which is what my good colleague or my friend down the road said. And then I was going to talk about the lack of research done in this field at the federal level and how that really impairs our ability to keep it safe and understand it at its highest level. I think that, so what I'll talk a little bit about is change is coming. I think that Senator Booker and his act, I think it's the Marijuana Justice Act that he's putting forward at the federal level, the conversations are happening. So I think if you think it's going to go away or states shouldn't participate or you shouldn't be involved, that to me wouldn't be a prudent way to go about this. It's to look at what's done and do it well. And in that I'll just say, don't reinvent the wheel. we're learning a lot from the other states, particularly from Colorado, and Washington and Oregon as well. We look to Massachusetts, who's trying to get it up and running as well. Canada is in the process of looking at it, New Hampshire, Vermont, the New England states. So I think that there are good minds out there doing good work to be safe and appropriate and comprehensive for an adult regulated market. And I think that that's the best way to approach this. Again, I wasn't a huge proponent of it. I'm continually learning new avenues and interest in it from a lot of different perceptions and perspectives. And so I'd just say, don't reinvent the wheel. Get a lot of information. There's a lot of great information out there.
So everybody's taken just about everything to say, so I'll keep mine light and I guess a little bit of fun. So, I mean, my message is really simple, like, don't be afraid. In Colorado, we rolled up our sleeves. We didn't really have the chance to fight about whether we should or shouldn't legalize. We just focused on good government, good policy. We had a lot of working groups and had people talk about how things should be done. We didn't do town halls and let people kind of fight about whether legalization should or shouldn't be done. We focused on how to do this correctly. And that's a very important part of the conversation to have. The bottom line is pretty simple. People are using cannabis in every single state across the country. This is not a question about whether people should or should not use cannabis. That question is kind of irrelevant at the moment. The question is really straightforward. The question is, where is this cannabis that they're using going to be coming from, and who is going to be in control of it? And that's just about it. So really simply, this is something that you can do. This is something that will probably be good for your state and your constituents in the aggregate policy area. And as I think we've seen in Colorado, regulation is a substantially better approach than prohibition.
Well, if you could please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you all for joining us for NCSL 2017 Legislative Summit in Boston, and we wish you safe travels home.